Well, I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving break this season, and it's good to be back. Just 2 weeks of class, and then the final exam. Of course, you do not have a final in this online course, but you will have your final exegetical paper that will be due during the finals week. I think most of you had your book reviews submitted by now, but we've come to Unit 13, the continuing stories of the biblical patriarchs, in particular, the latter stages of Jacob's sojourn outside of the promised land. So we continue the saga of Jacob's wandering, both physically and spiritually, as he is headed back to the promised land, so that the theme of blessing might come to pass, might be manifest through God's handiwork in his life. Again, he has been the deceiver, and then, of course, with Laban, he has been deceived, and as a result, spent a little bit longer than he wanted to, but gained a couple of wives, some concubines, and a bunch of kids, a bunch of children in the land. But now he's headed back with a large entourage of his own family, servants, livestock, and he's approaching the land on this journey. And in that process, we have two encounters with God in Transjordan. The first one is relatively brief. The place would be called Mahanaim, which means two camps. Machane, the word for camp, and the ayim ending, of course, is the dual ending in Hebrew. So the two camps and representing multiple facets of what's going on in the story. There will be two encounters with emissaries from God. The Malakim. There will be, of course, the division of his own camp into two camps in a way to try to set up that which would mean the saving of his life. At least that's his plan. And of course, there will be the second encounter with as it's called, a man. And then later, of course, we learn that this man is a representative from God, through whom Jacob receives a blessing, but only after imploring. It's interesting that as you look through and you read the commentary by Bruce Waltke, that he describes these two encounters as both prayer events, but the second one I'm not sure of. I wouldn't exactly call it a prayer when you're trying to demand a blessing from this emissary from God, but anyhow, that's the way that he outlines this pericope. I kind of like the first one that he mentioned on page 437 in your text, where you have the angels of God meet with Jacob, the two camps, and he prepares the two camps, and the angel of God meets him at the end, and then Jacob finally meets Esau in chapter 33. But the first one is definitely a prayer, so that once he has divided the camp and worked through it, as he implores God on the basis of that. And again, he's designed a plan for dividing his camp into two parts, and with hope that one would be attacked and he would be safe with the other camp. And then, of course, God assures him that he will survive the encounter with his brother, from whom he had escaped for, again, more than a decade. Those years up in northern Mesopotamia, in Padan Aram, in the area around Haran, and other sites in that northern part of the Aramean homeland. But of course, he must encounter God, both at Mahanaim and at Peniel, or Peniel, means the face of God, where he wrestles with God's messenger. In the process, he is blessed, though wounded. But holding on to the angel in the second story, he demands to be blessed, and he receives a blessing. So the cycle of blessings will reach a new zenith, of course, when he returns to Bethel. In chapter 35, which is the last section that you'll be working through for next week, he encounters God again. And so again, the larger, what we call inclusio, the bracketing of Jacob's sojourn, is when he leaves the land. At Bethel, of course, Bethel, we remember from earlier in Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham encountered God on the hill between Bethel and Ai. Jacob encounters God there back in chapter 28 on his departure from the land, and then again in chapter 35 upon renewal. In each case, the full blessing of the covenant relationship between God and Jacob is assured, and the story, of course, moves from there. But Bethel, formerly named Luz in the Canaanite history, would be renamed Bethel because of the encounter with God. Beit El, house of God, or Beit, used with the name of a deity, often means temple. So a temple of God would be represented in the name Bethel. We call these, by the way, there's a technical word for this naming process. It's called etiology, etiology. Etiology is a story to explain the naming of a given site. And so we have a number of these in the Old Testament, particularly in the patriarchal stories, but as well later on, for example, in the Israelite sojourn in the wilderness, both in Exodus and in the book of Numbers. One of the most gruesome is in that time when the second event, when God provides the quail, and people die from gorging themselves on meat that had spoiled. Many people die as a result, and so there's a place called Kivrot HaTa'ava. Kivrot is graves, HaTa'ava, graves of craving. So it's the naming of a site after an event that happened at the given location. So an etiology, the old English spelling was Aetiology, an etiology, the naming of a place to explain an event at the given site. So Bethel, Mahanaim, and Penuel are all three examples of etiology. The two camps of Mahanaim, the face of God, Panael, where Jacob wrestled with the messenger who he realized, with the man, as he's called at first, that he was a direct representative from God, God's messenger. It's interesting, though, that the same word for the divine messengers at Mahanaim, typically translated angels, is the term malakeh. That's the plural construct form, as found in the Hebrew text, by the way, as you probably found in your study, that you have the first verse in the Hebrew is the last verse in the English from chapter 31, verse 55, that when he journeys early in the morning, departing Mesopotamia, and then in verse 2 in the Hebrew text is when Jacob goes on his way and meets with the Malakeh Elohim, the messengers of God. So that construct form, the messengers of God, is one of the terminologies that we typically would translate angel. But it's also a term that can be used to refer to messengers, as in verse 4, when Jacob sends forth Vayishlach Yaakov Malakim, that he sends forth the messengers before him. So there are, again, the idea of Malak is a messenger who has the authority carried forth by the one who sends them. And so a Malach Elohim is a messenger of God. They have the authority to carry forth God's plan. Now, the messengers in verse 4, Malachim, Liphanai, as they go forth and engage Esau before the actual personal encounter between Jacob and Esau. And so the cycle of blessing that began at Bethel and returned to Bethel in chapter 34, which we will talk about next week.